Today I want to talk about something museums don't always want us thinking about. The fact that a lot of the artifacts sitting in glass cases or displayed under their soft lighting weren't exactly acquired peacefully. Many of them were taken during colonialism, sometimes violently, sometimes through pressure or manipulation, and sometimes just flat out stolen. And now people all around the world are asking for these objects to be returned. My thesis is that if we want to properly and ethically repatriate stolen artifacts, museums need to do more than hand things back. They need to be transparent, accountable, and willing to admit the colonial histories that made their collections possible. Even though there are arguments against repatriation, the evidence shows that ethical returns depend on openness and collaboration, not secrecy and control. To get started, one of the clearest explanations of how we got into this mess comes from Geraldine Palmer. She writes about how looting and the refusal to return artifacts aren't random issues. They're rooted in the systems of imperialism and racism that shaped Western museums from the beginning. And once you look into it, it becomes very obvious. Museums claim to be neutral educational spaces, but the way they handle cultural heritage often reflects a desire to hold onto power. Palmer argues that museums don't want to give that power up because giving back objects means giving up control over the narratives they've built. She also points out that the meaning of these objects changes depending on where they're located. To a museum, an artifact might be a piece of global heritage, but to the community it was taken from, that same object might be an ancestor, a spiritual being, or a living symbol of identity. When museums ignore or hide the violent histories behind these objects, they're not just avoiding tough conversations, they're allowing the original harm to continue. Now, even though there are international agreements meant to stop this kind of thing, they don't always work the way they were created to. Brigitte Hauser-Schoblin writes a lot about what happened after the 1970 UNESCO Convention, which was supposed to stop the illegal trade of cultural property. The convention definitely helped, but Hauser-Schoblin shows how artifacts still disappear into what she calls a Bermuda Triangle, made up of dealers, wealthy collectors, and the black market. Provenance records vanish, ownership becomes blurred, and objects move around the world with almost no accountability. So even though laws exist, they don't fully address the shady networks that profit from keeping artifacts' histories vague or incomplete. All this becomes more complicated when we compare museums in different countries. Victoria Reed writes about how European museums have started openly acknowledging the colonial violence in their collections. They're doing provenance research, returning stolen objects, and taking responsibility, even if it's uncomfortable. But American museums aren't really doing the same. Reed argues that many of them are decades behind. They rarely lead repatriation conversations, and they don't always make provenance information accessible to the public. By the way, provenance is where something is acquired. Like a mummy's provenance is Egypt. Reed's idea for fixing this is refreshingly simple. Museums should publish full provenance records online for everyone to see. Instead of locking information away, they should open it up. This makes it easier for communities to identify stolen items and to encourage real, honest conversations between museums and the people those objects were taken from. Before we go further, it's important to recognize that not everyone thinks repatriation is the right solution. James Cuno offers the biggest counterargument. He believes museums are better caretakers than modern states, and that cultural heritage should belong to the world, not just the descendants of a particular culture. He interviews museum directors and curators who argue that museums preserve artifacts, protect them from damage, and make them accessible to everyone. According to Cuno, sending artifacts back would limit access and potentially compromise the protection these objects receive. Though I don't fully agree with Cuno, I think his perspective is important. It forces us to think about what cultural heritage means and who gets to control it. And to be fair, some countries do struggle with resources, political instability, or storage conditions. The issue isn't that simple. But when we look at Palmer's research on colonial power, Hauser-Schoblin's work on secretive artifact networks, and Reed's call for transparency, a pattern emerges. The real obstacles to ethical repatriation aren't about who has the best museums, they're about who controls information, who benefits from the artifacts being where they are, and who gets to decide the narrative. So if we want repatriation to be ethical and actually meaningful, here's what it needs. First is transparency. Museums should tell the truth about where objects come from and how they get them. Publishing provenance openly is a great start. Second, accountability. Institutions need to acknowledge their role in colonial harm. Pretending the past didn't happen doesn't make it go away. And third, collaboration. Instead of assuming they know best, museums should work directly with source communities. These communities should have the biggest say in what happens to their own cultural heritage. In the end, returning stolen artifacts isn't about the objects themselves. It's about repairing broken relationships and recognizing that museums aren't neutral holders of the world's history. They're shaped by the same systems of power that allowed these objects to be taken in the first place. Ethical repatriation challenges museums to rethink their roles, their responsibilities, and the stories they tell. And maybe if we can do that honestly, we can start building a world where cultural heritage is respected, not because it's displayed behind glass, because its meaning is understood and honored by the people to whom it truly belongs. My name is Trano Hasso, and for this assignment, I chose archaeology and repatriation efforts for stolen artifacts. I used Geraldine Palmer, Brigida Hauser-Schablin, Victoria Reed, and James Cuno as my sources. Each of these sources came from Google Scholar or the Branson Library.